Good morning. Um, yes, we're talking about inclusion in citizen science today. And to kick off, I wanted to start off by talking about difference, because it's quite hard often to talk about difference. It's important to consider equity, diversity, and inclusion because we're all different. In any endeavour that touches people, it's important to be aware of the fact that this difference between the people interacting with the project affects perspective, which affects inputs and outputs of a project. Failing to understand these differences can lead not only to difficulties in communication and development of relationships, but it can also mean that one doesn't think of factors that are important to someone else or to the project. Engaging with difference has a profound impact on how we think about equality and equity, diversity and inclusivity. In the terms of equity and equality are the main basis of distributive justice, which is fairness in distributing resources. And those resources can be opportunities as well as physical resources. The meaning of what's fair is the difference between equity and equality. Equality is equal distribution from now, regardless of the individual's circumstance, whereas equity is the distribution that takes into account difference in the background of a person, which can arise from, for instance, systemic and historical disadvantages in an individual's circumstance. There's no way to talk about diversity without acknowledging difference. Difference is a fact. Discrimination is a problem. We have to acknowledge difference in order to ensure we're considering diverse stakeholders. And once we've considered these diverse stakeholders, we need to understand what makes them different in order to create a project that implicitly and explicitly includes each one. Talking about difference can also help us see privilege, which is particularly invisible in cases where one has it. The discourse about privilege has opened up over the last few years, but there remain systemic privileges and power dynamics that can often be hard to spot without talking about difference and actively talking about difference. Back in 2013, the University of Texas Computer Science Department was spending a lot of time on evaluating applications from prospective students. One of the faculty members teamed up with a graduate student to come up with an algorithm that could help sort applications, such that only applications at the cusp of making it onto the course would require appraisal by the faculty admissions team. Grade, as it was called, trained on a database of previous applications using different categories to score application and predict how likely the admissions committee would be to accept the application. This saved the admissions committee a lot of time, as they would normally carry out multiple passes over the admissions pool before deciding on the year's intake. With grade, most applications pass through review by only one committee member before approval, allowing more time for assessing borderline cases. It worked a treat, reducing the appraisal workload of full reviews by more than 70%. However, choices made in the coding of the algorithm, particularly in the choice of what factors should be considered, were based primarily on the decisions of the two developers. In one case, the reputation of the institutions attended by an applicant, values for the reputation of institutions were crowdsourced into categories of elite, good, or other from the computer science department's faculty members, who developed a list of elite and good institutions. If an institution fell outside of these two lists, good and elite, it would be listed as other, and the applicant's score would be lower. This means that a static, predefined list of institutions developed by a small number of people with no peer review, no oversight, and potentially very little diversity significantly affected people with the chances of an individual being accepted onto a course. Crucially, the algorithm used machine learning on an historical database allowing it to encode the biases inherent in the recruitment system prior to 2013, and taking no account of either race or gender in its mode of evaluation of the materials. This was an active decision by the two developers to code race and gender as having no effect on the evaluation. At first, you might think this is an excellent example of equality. However, it demonstrates the very real risk of failing to consider difference. It's equality, but not equity. Differences in university application behaviours that can arise from the background of an applicant can have large effects on the success of that applicant. Some of the measures in the UTCS assessment protocol have been introduced to reduce this effect. For instance, letters of recommendation were introduced into the evaluation process in order to bolster the applicants who come from a disadvantaged background. Yet the standing and affiliation of the referees was not taken into account in the algorithm. It isn't that the algorithm could not have had these factors implemented into it, but rather that these factors were not coded in, presumably because they were not considered important. In December 2020, the working of the algorithm became widely known after it was presented in a talk at another university. To those working in anti-discrimination, it was immediately apparent that the algorithm ran the risk of encoding admissions discrimination. Decisions that would have disadvantaged already underrepresented groups, causing a loud outcry against the use of the algorithm. The algorithm's now being phased out, although it's been stated that this is because it's too hard to maintain, and the developers maintain that it gives fair predictions for its purpose. This is a very concrete case where design decisions by those within a bubble have undoubtedly affected who is able to participate, in this case in an educational environment. Oh, my picture's missing. But why is this important to citizen science? Well, who takes part in citizen science makes a difference to the people involved and to the project. Engaging in citizen science projects can be considered a privilege. It's affording someone the opportunity to influence something, the outcome of the work, the data that is collected, in some cases, the framing of the problem itself. This is a form of giving voice and to be excluded from it means that in this context, someone's voice will not be heard. This has implications for social justice and also for the quality of the research. Involving citizen scientists from diverse backgrounds can open up opportunities to incorporate local or traditional knowledge that would otherwise be missing. Including multiple stakeholders in co-design and co-creation of citizen science projects can increase the work's impact as well as its relevance, and it can contribute to innovation and social well-being, and also to the project's longevity and sustainability. You can choose at which stage of the project who to involve if you know who all the stakeholders are. Knowing who is a stakeholder in the project improves how data and information is shared within the project and externally. But nevertheless, it's important to make sure to actively consider differences in order to ensure that the projects aren't created that may look fair and accessible to those who designed them, but that create barriers to others, as we saw in the case of the University of Texas algorithm. That can be quite easy to do. We need to be sure that we have considered carefully the involvement of all of those with an interest in or who are affected by a project and understood how to make those projects accessible and attractive to them. And I would say here that the assessment and support document that we did on Monday helps to understand what your underlying values are for the design of the project, which can help you to work out how best to design the projects to include other stakeholders, because you know the position that you're coming from and what you want to achieve, not only with the outcomes of the citizen science project, but also in terms of any kind of social factors that you are aiming for. And during our interactive session later on today, we're going to be looking at the different stakeholders, mapping stakeholders, and then designing the project to be more inclusive. So now I'm going to hand over to Gefion, who's going to discuss the particular challenges of inclusivity online.
Thank you, Kat. So I'm starting from a point where I tend to start always, because there's this general assumption in research as well as in society that online everyone can participate. It's just a flat that makes everything equal. Everyone can go online, therefore everyone can participate. I don't know if anyone is still familiar with on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. That extends to nobody knows you're a woman, nobody knows you're a person of color, nobody knows you're disadvantaged, whatever the case may be. And that is, and you find that anywhere and everywhere. And it's kind of, this came up with the internet becoming a thing in society. And that was just this blanket assumption that this would be the case. And therefore, engaging online would be easy, and we would all become more politically engaged as well. I want to spoiler this and say that obviously this is not correct. Kat, can you move the slide? Because the reality is that it's not for everyone. And using the web, especially using the web as a form of engagement and processes, is a sign of privilege per se. Because you need a lot of skills and resources in order to be online, in order to engage online, and then in order to engage in specific activities online. You need basic literacy, you need a certain level of education, you need the time and the leisure time to actually be able to invest in that. And if you're worried about how you put bread on the table, you're certainly not going to be worried about how you engage in citizen science. You need the financial resources, you need access to the internet, you probably need broadband nowadays, you need the hardware. There are still many families who only have a single computer in the household. And then if they try to distance educate 3 children at the same time, that is going to cause problems. And lastly, you need a certain level of experience, of knowledge of the platforms, of knowledge of the specific processes you want to engage in. Specifically, if you want to engage in citizen science, you probably need to know it exists in the first place. You need to know what it means. You need to know where to even look for that form of engagement. And what that means in practice is that many of the inequalities that you find offline, like education, like finances, like literacy, they are reproduced online. So everything that is making groups disadvantaged offline has an impact on whether or how they use the web, and if they use it, for what sort of benefit they derive from that. And just going online doesn't remove that disadvantage, and that is a really key thing to understand. And then there's some additional challenges online, which I'll touch on in a bit. Kat, can you move the slide? Thank you. So this is an example from my own research. This is what I've written my PhD about, which is online participation in the Green Party Germany, who have introduced a set of online tools to engage their members further. This is political participation, but ultimately it's not far removed from what you would do in citizen science. You still want to engage people. And these tools were introduced with an assumption that it would make participation easier for everyone across the party, across all of the members. That was the base assumption. It becomes easier for everyone to engage, except maybe old people. Like, that was the only limitation that was seen, that maybe age had an impact, and you know, your grandma might not be so keen on using these tools. If you move this slide. But what we found in practice is that, and don't get disturbed by the German terminology there, those are just 2 different tools that I've been looking at. And it doesn't really matter what they are for this exercise, but what we found in practice is that there were a lot of factors that influenced who actually adopted these tools or wanted to adopt them and what they did with them. And it was also different between the tools. So you can't even say, you know, engaging online, if you do it in one way, you do it in any other, because it depends on the platform and it depends on the purpose. So this is the Green Party, and I think they are pretty European, and you're probably all fairly familiar with the movement. But in principle, they are founded on equality and specifically on women's rights as one of their founding pillars. And one of the things that they found, and as you can see there in the top right, is that women actually participated less on these online platforms. And that is for a party that in all of their processes insists on at least a 50% share of women in everything they do. And suddenly they take it online, and the women, well, they don't disappear, but they certainly aren't represented in the way that they ought to be and that they would be in any other processes. They did see older generations engaging less, which is the only thing that was really expected. They also saw people with higher education actually engaging less, which is uncommon, and it usually people with university degrees are engaged more. In this case, they engage less, and my personal theory is that that is because of the tools and the activities they were being asked to do. But ultimately, the people who were really keen on these tools and the people who were really enthusiastic about them, those were the ones who really adopted them and who really took to them and used them actively. Can you move slides? Thank you. So in summary, what we expected to find was that everyone, maybe apart from old people, would benefit from these tools. But what we found in practice is that people with lower education engaged more, men engaged more, and the people who had this enthusiasm for the tool to begin with were also more likely to adopt. Now that causes obvious problems, primarily with regards to gender, because actively, well, not actively, but passively excluding women in a movement that really values their engagement is a huge issue. So they've now they've now developed some methods to ensure that women are represented online as well as offline. But the other part of that is that what they really got in their online engagement was just more of the same. They had an offline network of members, and they didn't expand any of the groups they were targeting in taking things online. So what they did is they really reflected this digital divide where people had less education, less resources, less spare time. Apart from, the highest education, which was sort of an outlier there, but the participation in their online tools reflected this divide that was there to begin with. We found that the tool and the people you target matters, and that you can't just assume because people engage in one way, they will also engage in another. You have to actively engage them in wherever you want them to participate. And especially if you use more than one platform for that, which I know some of you do, you'll have to think about each of those platforms and not assume that they all work the same. And that is me, Kat.
Great, thank you, Gefion. So we are going to be thinking this morning about how to build inclusive projects. And so there are a few steps to be thinking about. And also I wanted to mention that I'm going to put after this session a series of guidelines about diversity and citizen science projects into the shared folders for the kickoff meeting, and would like to go through those with you at the start of the Accelerator in March. So in order to build inclusive projects, we need to make sure that we're challenging our own assumptions and biases. So, I mean, as with Gefion's example with the Green Party, assuming that you're going to get the same kind of participation when you change tools is an assumption that needs to be thought about, and understanding how that's going to affect, or how tool choice might affect the affordance of the projects for people. We also need to know who is likely to be affected by the project overall. So this is where stakeholder mapping comes in very, very useful, and we're going to have a first go at that in the session following. That's all the people who might be affected by your project, not just the immediate circle. And when you've looked at those stakeholders, you want to ask who's not here and not part of the project already, and why aren't they? And if they're not, how can we make things more affordable to them, as in more appealing or more able to be participated in? One way to always make sure that you're checking back with yourself is to actively seek out different perspectives. So perspectives from people who are outside of your own bubble or outside of your group with whom you're working, outside of your team. Always try to talk to people who will have a different perspective from you, in order to make sure that you're checking how the project is coming across, and to see whether there are any things that you haven't thought of yet. It's also very important to consider language, and by that I mean not only the spoken language, so English, German, French, whichever language is, but also the use of language and the signposting and signaling that the use of language gives. As citizen science projects, we're in a kind of particularly interesting situation where you're a bridge between civil society and academia in some ways. And so it's interesting and important to think about the use of language in the ends of these spectra, and understanding how best to use that language is in order to make the project understandable to different target groups is really important. And we'll also be covering some of these kind of communication aspects on Friday morning. Always monitor and analyze who's taking part in a way that is appropriate to your context, so that you know who's involved and can see if there are any gaps. And most importantly, I would say, we can't get everything right all the time, and it's really important to listen to the feedback from people who you ask, particularly if you're seeking out different perspectives. Listen actively and lean into difficult challenges. So approach things with an open heart and soul and mind, and lean into these difficult challenges so that you can bring more people into the work. Gefion, would you like to add thoughts?
No, I think you've pretty much covered it. I mean, the one thing I would generally add is to think about different routes for people to engage. So only offering one single way to sort of get in touch with you, to engage with the group, will be exclusive for people who are not, who don't lend themselves, where their lives doesn't lend themselves to that way of engagement. So that is the one thing I would maybe consider on top of everything that we both have already said.
Great.